Yeah, okay, great. Over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thanks for hanging in so late in the night. That's good. Look, I'm going to talk to you about spirit release therapy and the type, as Joy said, the types of entities that I take out of people. And I'll say a little bit about how they have affected the various clients that I'm taking them out of. I've been doing this for about 10 years now. And then I'm going to look at the reasons why we have these attachments, people have these attachments. And I'm also going to look, rather than just give you those basic details, I'm also going to look at the role of spirit release therapy in the evolution of humankind on this planet, because it does have a role to play in where we are going as a species, because there are some elements at large that want to stop us evolving, and quite a bit of the work I do is about dealing with those or coming up against those elements. I would say at the start, I can see these entities when I put myself into a light trance state, and often if they're intelligent enough, I can communicate with them, and I can take them out of the person's energy field. So that's just sort of setting the stage. Now, I'll start off by telling you about some of the types of entities I work with, and the first one's earthbound entities, but I call them EBEs, and they are the people that have deceased and they haven't moved on to the next realm. They've remained earthbound and they're wandering the earth basically. Now, for a number of reasons, instead of going on to the next realm or going to the light, as I call it, they will stay here, and sometimes they will attach themselves to the energy structure of another human being. For instance, let me say, some of these attachments are quite benign and others are quite destructive. A benign one may be, for instance, if a child dies in a hospital and is confused, and some reason isn't drawn to the light, it may attach itself to the very friendly nurse that's been looking after him. Now, the nurse may not even be aware that the spirit of that child is attached to her, and she would have no effects from it. The child would be quite a benign influence within her. It needs to be removed, of course, because the child's not moving on and learning and developing. The spirit's static or moribund while it's in that other person. An example of a destructive one would be if you have I had one woman that came to me, and she had a number of issues, and they were in part caused by the fact that she had a male entity that had attached to her. And when I spoke to this male entity, which I can do, I said to it, are you aware that you are deceased, have died? And it said, no, I haven't died. I've got a body. You're talking to it right now. And it thought that the woman's body was its body. And I said, no. And I had to explain to it what was going on. And it didn't want to leave. It was quite adamant that it wanted to stay where it was. And it was controlling this woman's behaviour to a large degree. Now, I can't cast out an earthbound entity. I have to negotiate them out. And I negotiated him out eventually. So that's earthbound entities. I'll put these into four broad categories. There are other elements within these categories, but the next category I'm looking at is thought forms. A thought form can take the form of a curse. If someone puts a curse on you, that's basically they're projecting a thought form onto you. And I get a number of them, and they're very powerful. If I get a curse, I usually deal with the effect on the client, and then I will follow that effect back to the person that's launched the curse, and then I will deal with that person and I will negotiate with them, and if they are unwilling to be reasonable and stop doing it, which they sometimes will do, I will then have to get a bit rough with them and demonstrate some power. to convince them that if they don't stop, they will have a hard time from me. The first time this ever happened to me, I had an entity in a woman. It wasn't a thought form; it was a dark entity, and when I get entities like that, I can trace their energy trail back to where they've come from, and I usually do that because if they're being under attack and I don't get rid of the source, they'll be attacked once again when after I've cleaned them up. And I found this trail went back to a couple of 100 years ago into a past life, and there were 4 men in a castle in a stone room, and they were the king's sorcerers. And they were conducting black magic for him against his enemies, and this woman in one of those lifetimes had been one of those people, and this had carried through into the current lifetime. And they were still operating in the astral zone. So I said to them, guys, you've got to stop what you're doing, it's not good. And they said, no, we're not going to, you can't make us. And I said to my higher self, what do I do here? How do I handle this? And it said, hit them with light. So I built up the light in myself till I was like an incandescent bulb, and then I just flooded the room with brilliant white light. It was like an atomic bomb went off. I was quite impressed myself, actually, not having done that before. And when that had cleared, they were just ordinary people again. They were no longer sorcerers. All their powers had gone from them. So I left it with them, and the woman had no more trouble from that quarter. It's not always that dramatic, of course, but sometimes it is. The third category I want to look at is a really interesting one. This is past life personalities. I discovered that some people that have quite a bit of trouble overcoming their problems, and I would say here to you that a lot of the people come and see me have people that have been everywhere else, or a lot of other places. They've been to psychologists, they've been to kinesiologists, they've been to people that say they can clear things out of them, and they can't, and they've still got problems, and it's often because they've got an attachment to them. When you've got one of these entities, especially if it's a strong one working within you, all the other therapies you do are going to be compromised to some degree, and they won't be as successful as they would be if you were clear. So I routinely clear people now when they come to me before I do anything else. And if they're clear, 10 minutes I know, and we can get on with psychotherapy. But if they're not, we'll spend most of the first session getting rid of whatever's in there. With past life personalities, I didn't really come across them until I'd been working in this field for a couple of years. And what I was working with a woman once, and she was, you could probably say she had a global delay, which is a little bit like Asperger's, and she found life very difficult, and she had trouble learning, and she had trouble relating to other people. And I was working with her, and I looked into her, and I saw a woman that lived in a tribal situation, and she had a hut and she had a cooking pot, and she didn't want to know anything else. And there were white people coming into the area, so her tribe was undergoing this transition from traditional law to experiencing a whole lot of influences and amazing things that they had never considered possible. And she was resisting this mightily and closed her mind off entirely to it. And I realized that that personality hadn't gone to the light. It was in the astral zone, and it was stuck there. And from the astral zone, it was directly influencing my client, which is its own future incarnation, or one of its own future incarnations, and keeping her in that state. My client had limited her mentality in this state by being that way in the last state. So it was a karmic situation, and it was being held in place by the past life personality. I worked with that past life personality until the scene in which we were opened up, and there was light there, and it left. It said to me, "Thank you very much," and went to the light. From that point on, my client could make some progress. I had another one that was really interesting in a similar way, and it was a gentleman that was experiencing a lot of fear in his life, especially fear of death. He was really, really frightened of dying. And I found when I went in and worked with him, I was working remotely with this gentleman. I put myself in a trance state and went and worked with him through his subconscious mind. I found that he had been a person of high status in the ancient Egypt, and he had undergone an initiation ceremony, which was a very deep and serious ceremony in those days, and people often trained a number of years to get ready for it, and it was quite dangerous. And it was dangerous for him because it didn't work, or he didn't handle it properly, and his past life personality got stuck in a limbo zone. It was in a sort of a darkish place. It wasn't on the ground, it wasn't in the air, it was just stuck, and it had been there for a long time. A very uncomfortable position for any part of someone to be in. And I realised that this is possibly where his fear of death came from, because he could sort of see that dying didn't necessarily mean you went to a better place. It meant you could get stuck in a place like that indefinitely. So I then did some work on that past life personality and managed to move it out of that state into the light. And then my client started making progress and eventually overcame that fear of death and could move on. So they are really powerful influences, those. Thanks, Joyce. They're really powerful influences. And most people wouldn't be aware that they've got something like that operating in them. But come to someone like me and I can find it for you. Look, at this point, the next level, the next category is dark entities. But before I go on to dark entities, I think I'll just go back to the beginning and tell you how I first got interested in, or got involved in doing this kind of work. Because I used to work in the mental health field, and I'd studied to I'd studied a hypnotherapy diploma, and I was in the process of building up a practice part-time during the evenings and weekends. And one day I was home from work and I was sitting on my exercise bike trying to get some exercise, of course, and I was so bored with sitting on an exercise bike I closed my eyes and went into a meditative state. And then to my surprise I saw one of my clients from work standing in front of me in the garage in my home, out of work hours, and of course I'm seeing like this client in the astral form. And as I looked at this person, I saw superimposed over their abdomen a head of this sort of animal type thing with this big sharp teeth and hair all over the place, and it was screaming at me. And I thought, what's it screaming at me for? And it was saying, and when I listened, it was saying, you can't make me leave, you can't make me leave. And it was screaming it over and over. And without thinking, I just thought, oh, yes, I can. And I jumped off the exercise bike. My body stayed on the exercise bike. I, in my sort of spiritual astral form, jumped off the exercise bike, went around behind my client because there was no way I was going to stick my hand in that big mouth. And I started to pull this entity out of my client from the back at their lumbar spine area. And I pulled it out. And as I pulled it out, I started wrapping it up in like bandages of light. It was just like bandages, but it was made of light. Now, the interesting thing is I'd never done anything like that before. I'd never worked with light in that way before, and I'd never pulled an entity out of anything before. But it just seemed to be natural for me to do it. So maybe I've done this work in a past life, I don't know. Quite possibly, because this just came to me. So I ended up wrapping this thing up. And in the end, I'm standing there holding it in my two hands, and it's like a mummy wriggling and writhing and making these muffled screams. It's really very angry. And I thought, well, what am I going to do with this? I have to do something with it. And it came to me immediately that I should take it up. And I thought I was going to take it to the light, but I didn't. I went up and up and up with this thing in my arms, and I came to a plateau where everything was grey. And it was like a plain, and everything was grey. The sky was grey, the plateau was grey, the rocks were grey, there was no other colour anywhere. And I just came to this big wall, and it was a prison. And and I was told, and I was shown how to deposit this being, wrapped as it was, on the other side of the wall, which I did. And that I called that the grey zone. And since that time, I've put a lot of beings into the grey zone. Ones that won't go to the light, ones that are very intractable, and they've just got to be taken out of circulation, because if they're not, they'll just attack someone else or re-attack your client. So that's how I first got started, and I realised that, okay, these entities can be in people, I can see them, and I can take them out. Now, the way I took that out was very a bit violent on my part in some ways, and I've learnt to be much more subtle about how I handle these things now. But basically, that was the principles and elements were all present there at that time. And it wasn't until a year or two later, I had another experience like that, but it wasn't until a year or two later, when I was practicing as a hypnotherapist, that I actually had a person that I could do this practice on. And that occurred with a child who his mother brought him to see me, but he wouldn't come into the office, and he wouldn't see me, and he was very angry and he was very upset. And the mother was in tears because she said, the doctors want to put him on medication and I don't want to. He's too young. He was only about 10 or something. He's still at primary school, and they were going to kick him out of primary school if his behaviour didn't improve. And the mother was just crying, and I said, and the boy wouldn't come up to see me. I went down to talk to him, but he wouldn't talk to me. So I said to her, look, I have done some work at a psychic level with people before, and I was referring to those two cases. I said, if you want, I can go home tonight and work on him for you and see what happens. I don't know how it would go, but I'll try it if you're happy to. And she said, yes, please do it. So I took her. I went home that night and I put myself into a trance state. I basically hypnotized myself, and I'd seen the child, so I could imagine him, and I've since realised that I now work with a photograph. If I work remotely with someone, I can use the photograph to get a direct contact with them. So I made contact with this child, and he had this raging dark entity in him, which I took out, much the same as I've just described before, wrapped it up, and then consigned it to a place from which it couldn't return. And the mother said to me the next day, she rang me and she said, you've given me my son back. He's completely different. And I thought, wow, we're onto something here. This is a useful procedure. Now this is probably a main part of my work. Now I don't do much straight hypnotherapy anymore. Interesting thing about this boy, and that was that he'd been targeted. I worked with him off and on for about a year, but he was being targeted because I found that in a past life he had been an important person in South America, in either the Aztec or the Mayan culture there, possibly both. He'd incarnated a few times there, and in those cultures they worked very much with the dark side. It was pre-Christian cultures, it was really common for the high priests and the elite to work with the dark side and use the power for various reasons. And he'd done that. And the thing with the dark side is when they make an agreement with you, or you're willing to make an agreement with them, is the agreement, for, as far as they're concerned, isn't just for your life, this current lifetime. For them, it's forever. So they were following him through into this lifetime and wanted him back. They wanted him on side. And I'll go a little bit more into why actually in a minute, but they wanted him on side, so they attacked him again, and I had to do a fair bit of work with him. His mother also, as it turned out, had been with him, had been associated with him in that life, one of those lifetimes in South America, and she had come through into this lifetime with him to help him overcome that influence. That was part of the reason she was his mother in this lifetime anyway. Now he had that was a dark entity that was in that boy, so I'll deal with them now. Dark entities are different to the first three categories I've looked at, because earthbound entities, thought forms, and past life personalities are all directly coming from the people concerned. An earthbound entity is a deceased human. Thought forms can come from dark entities, but they mostly come from other people. And sometimes they can come from, thought forms can be often, not often, I'll be careful, but not irregularly, they will come from a parent to a child. So if a parent is overly concerned with a child, or actually hates their child and punishes their child and tortures their child, they will either consciously or accidentally imbue some of their energy into that child. And even when the parent's deceased or out of the picture, that energy will be influencing that child quite strongly. That energy, I can take it out as an independent entity, and I can either return it to the parent or I can destroy it. So they're people oriented, and the past life personalities are obviously connected with your reincarnation. Dark entities are quite different. They are spiritual beings that have never had a human form, and they have they're the fallen ones, like fallen angels and that type of thing, and they're the ones that have taken to the dark side, and their role is to enter into human beings and make their lives as difficult as they possibly can, and they do it very well. And a lot of people, I don't know what percentage of the population have them in them. Of course, I get a high percentage of my clients with them, but they come to me because they're troubled. So I don't know, in the untroubled population, I don't know how prevalent they are. I'll give you an example of a couple of dark entities in clients. One was a client who's come from a very Christian family, and he rebelled against the precepts of the church, and was drinking and taking drugs and into porn and so on and so forth. He reached a certain age in his early 20s, and he suddenly realised that he wanted to stop, and he basically stopped overnight. He didn't take any more drugs, he didn't drink anymore, and he stopped watching porn, and he just went straight, too straight in fact. But anyway, he went straight. And at the same day he stopped, a dark entity started talking to him in his head and attacked him and would not go away. And when I started working with him, it was about 8 years later, and he'd never been able to get rid of it, and he tried all sorts of things. Well, when I looked at him, this entity was just immediately very obvious and very dark, very aggressive, and swore at me and told me that he belonged to him and I couldn't do anything about it. And so I wrapped the bugger up and pulled him out and got rid of him. However, and at this point I'll mention that when I do this sort of work, I always follow up with some form of psychotherapy, because you can see in a case like this person has got some issues. One, he's got issues with his parents from his childhood, because he's rebelled against them. That has to be sorted. Two, he's got an issue with guilt about things that have happened in his life and what he's done, because he feels he's been punished. And three, he's got an issue because he's had this thing in him. He's lived a dissolute life on drugs and alcohol, and he's lived a life tormented by this thing. And it's not always easy to move to a life where both those things are gone. So big adjustment for him. So I had to do a lot of work with him, but he improved. Another case I had recently was a woman came and saw me, and she had lacking confidence. Nothing in her life would go well. When she got set something up, it would fail. She was just despairing of ever finding any happiness in her life. And she sat down. She came and saw me face to face, and she sat down, and when I do this sort of work face to face, I put the person in an upright chair and I stand behind them and put my hands near them, and I get them to do a breathing exercise to relax, and then I go into an altered state and I can work with them. And she just had this great big grey thing in her from her waist up, through up the top of her head, and about half a metre above her head, and it was that big, and it was completely dominating. And I told her that it was there, and she said, "I've been telling people, for my friends for years, I've got an entity of some sort," and they all laughed at me. So I took it out. Now, this entity was very interesting because it was grey, it wasn't black. They're usually black. Grey ones are a bit uncommon. I asked it why it was grey and not black. It might have been a silly question, but I was prepared to be laughed at. And it said to me, and the other thing was, it was a very old one. When these entities have been doing this work for possibly thousands of years, they get a bit tired sometimes, and they're more willing to talk to you then. So which is handy, because you can ask them why they're doing what they're doing. And I said, "What's your role in this woman?" He said, to keep her down, to stop her evolving. And I said, "Okay." I said, "Why are you grey and not black?" It said, "Well, I'm from an earlier stream." And I said, "How do you mean?" She said, "Well," he said, "the black ones are from another stream and they came later." So in other words, there's a hierarchical organisation amongst these dark entities, and I've never, Christians would reckon that Satan's the top guy. Some people tell me they've met Satan, but I haven't. But they obviously seem to be frightened of people above them, and I have met one or two dark entities higher up in the hierarchy, and they're probably more intelligent. The ones at the lower level don't know much. They're kept in the dark, literally, I think. And I saw this, and it told me that, in other words, a bunch of entities. Let me retrace this for a minute and make sense of it by saying to you that these dark entities are not evil right to the very core, and they were created by the same God that created all the other entities that exist in the universe, by the Great Spirit or God or Allah or whatever you want to call it. But they have chosen to take this dark pathway, and they come in streams, and one stream was the greys, and they were the first, and then the blacks followed, and the greys are sort of much smaller in number. Human beings, by the way, tend to reincarnate in streams too. We don't reincarnate haphazardly. As most of you probably know, we reincarnate nearly always with people we've known in other lifetimes, and we work out our karma with them. And it makes a lot of sense, rather than starting again with people new all the time. But also people work in streams, like you'll have people that have had a lot of tribal lives will tend to move into certain occupations like healing and alternative therapies. People that have maybe come through more societies with more advanced technologically and administratively, like the Roman Empire and so on, they'll move more into professional type